For the last year and a half, Hennepin History Museum has had an ongoing collaboration with A Public History of 35W, a community engaged research project through the University of Minnesota's Heritage Studies and Public History program. This project centers the perspective of South Minneapolis residents who lived through the creation of 35W in the 1960s, who persevered through its 50-year existence, and who are now nearing the end of its 5-year reconstruction. I think a lot of us are happy to see that reconstruction culminating. You'll hear more from A Public History of 35W in a moment, but I will say for now that together with them, we've hosted a series of virtual events over the past year, and soon we will present an exhibit at Hennepin History Museum called Human Toll, A Public History of 35W, which will open this fall. For our program tonight, we're happy to partner with the Bell Museum, Minnesota's Natural History Museum. Tonight's conversation supports the Bell Museum's current temporary exhibition, Climates of Inequality, Stories of Environmental Injustice. The exhibition was created by Humanities Action Lab, an international coalition of students, educators, and community leaders that produces projects on urgent social issues. As part of this coalition, students and faculty at the University of Minnesota worked with community partners to understand what environmental justice looks like here in the Twin Cities. The exhibition focuses on storytelling and local experience and focuses on the communities that bear the greatest impact from environmental degradation, but also contribute the least to it. Stories deal with the redevelopment at the Upper Harbor Terminal in Minneapolis and at the Ford plant in St. Paul, with urban farming in the East Phillips neighborhood, disaster recovery in North Minneapolis, and with the rights of wild rice. And it includes some content in Spanish as well as English. So I'll post a number of links here when I finish talking. You can still visit the exhibition at the Bell for a few days longer. It's open until May 16th, and you'll purchase those tickets on their website. So I'll share that link in just a minute. Two housekeeping issues before we jump into tonight's program. First of all, we are recording this program and we'll share it digitally in a few different ways afterwards, so stay tuned for information about that. Second, if you are watching this call today, this is a webinar, so only panelists have camera and microphone enabled. You can interact with the panelists by using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen in the center. So please ask questions to panelists there. And you can also use the chat for general conversation and questions about technology. So with that, I will turn things over to community advisor and research advisor for A Public History of 35W, Dr. Ernest Lloyd.
Thank you, Dr. Hunt. Let me just say, it's good to be here tonight, moderating a title or an event that's so important to Minnesota and also to the country as a whole. In doing so, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in North Carolina to a sharecropper. I marched for civil rights and social justice rights with some of our great civil rights leaders of our day, including Russell Means, Reverend Dr. Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King's successors following his assassination, and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. In 1980, I came to Minnesota to work for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And as such, I started to continue my civil rights career by working as a contract compliance officer and later as a supervisor and then director of the Office of Civil Rights. The most important thing to me at that time was I was helping minority and women-owned businesses right a wrong. Wrong means they were denied contract access to a federal aid contract. The right means I wrote policy to ensure that they receive equitable opportunity to participate on federal aid contract. At the same time, I wrote my dissertation at Hamline University titled, How Routing an Interstate Highway Through South Minneapolis Disrupted an African-American Neighborhood. It gives me great pleasure to know that A Public History of 35W springboarded from my dissertation and gave me this joy to know that it is not someplace on library collecting dust, but being used by Greg and Denise to help find more about how 35W impacted African-American middle-class community from a financial perspective. So we're trying to find all the answers to where did the people move who got disrupted? How much were they paid for their home that the state took by condemnation? And if they move, where did the African-American go? So these things that give me great joy, working with Denise and Greg and the team, and yourself, Dr. Hunt, regarding 35W project. And now, I will introduce our panelists for tonight. Mr. Marvin Roger Anderson is the local historian and community activist, and prior to his retirement, served as the Minnesota State Law Librarian from 1980 to 2002. Mr. Anderson had been a key figure in the effort to memorialize the historically Black St. Paul neighborhood of Rondo Avenue, which was destroyed, as many of us know, in the 1960s during the construction of I-94. He is the co-founder of Rondo Day Festival, which marked its 36th year in 2018. He was instrumental in the establishment of the Rondo Commemorative Plaza, which opened in the summer of 2018. He had done numerous oral history interviews recounting life in the Rondo neighborhood. Mr. Anderson is a co-founder and first president of the Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers. He was a board member and past chair of the University of Minnesota Archie Gibbons for African American Literature. This man done everything. Former board member of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, Region Hospital Board of Directors, Minnesota Humanity Commission Board of Trustees, and U.S. Bank Community Advisory Board. He currently serves as the project director of the Rondo Commemorative Plaza and chairs the board of directors for the Rondo Center of Diverse Expression and newly created community meeting place and Rondo Museum, and of Reconnect Rondo, an organization with a mission to pursue a land bridge over I-94 in the Rondo corridor. Mr. Anderson, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lloyd, for that introduction.
Mr. Cyrus Knutson is Director of Minnesota Department of Transportation Center for Community Connections, created to respond to requests from community, businesses, and government partners to utilize underused highways land for social and economic benefit. I really want to hear about that. Cyrus had worked for the state of Minnesota for 33 years. I guess I have almost 40. The past 28 of which he had worked for MnDOT in transportation planning. Cyrus specializes in developing and managing new programs in response to changing transportation needs and new expectations by the public. Welcome, Mr. Knutson.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you for including me in this esteemed panel.
You're quite welcome, sir. Now, Dr. Brian Muthyala is an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Minnesota. He attends St. Paul Central High School, and he is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Medical School and completed his residency training at the University of Minnesota Internal Medicine and Pediatric Program. His educational interests lie in teaching on social and structural determinants of health as they relate to clinical training, as well as increasing, get this, increasing equity and justice content into medical school curriculum. Welcome, Dr. Muthyala.
Really nice to be here. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And now, I'd like to pose before we get to our question, something I need to say about environmental justice. And it tells us that environmental justice is a condition by which people live within a particular surrounding. Conditions such as inadequate access to healthy food, to healthcare, especially the low income, the poor and BIPOC individuals. Environmental justice is an important element for people who have traditionally lived, worked, and congregated closest to sources of pollution. To grapple with and bring some understanding of how and where policyholders were dealing with environmental justice issues, as such, we have invited you guys this evening, to have us to understand where do we go from here? How do we look at environmental justice from the eyes of planners and policymakers? Because we know that if we don't learn from the past, we were doomed to repeat the past. We find ourselves spinning wheels and going nowhere. So because of this, we're here tonight to talk about the past and lead to the present from an environmental justice perspective. My first question tonight, I would like to pose to Mr. Anderson.
Oh, Ernest, before we jump into questions, I think Mr. Anderson will make a presentation first.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And then Cyrus will make one. So Mr. Anderson, I believe you want me to start with a video. Is that correct?
If you would, please.
I will.
Thank you, Greg.
Does that look like a video on the screen there?
It does.
Here goes.
Public officials and bus manufacturers, it's hard to imagine how the streetcar could have turned a profit in the...
Here we go.
After years of mounting losses, the St. Paul end of the interurban line shut down in 1953 and the Minneapolis portion in 1954. While there is reason to believe that the streetcar's demise was hastened by the collusion among public officials and bus manufacturers, it's hard to imagine how the streetcar could have turned a profit in the face of mounting competition from private automobiles. All those cars created a lot of congestion, prompting public officials to begin planning a new freeway that would connect the downtowns and tie into the new interstate highway system. The engineers favored a route just south of University, but George Harold, a former St. Paul city planner, opposed it.
Harold, the planner for the city, was adamant that it should go north along the railroad track and not go along the University corridor. He just thought it was going to divide all the residential areas and fragment the city, cut the capital off from downtown. And he was absolutely right. Everything he said was true, but he lost the argument. When the freeway came, they were looking for the cheapest land and the most direct route. And the cheapest land and most direct route was south of University.
Many neighborhoods would lose some of their housing because of the freeway. Prospect Park lost more than 100 homes, but the Rondo neighborhood lost everything.
When I was a child, it was the center of the African American community. There was a lot of businesses there.
When I-94 came through and took out the Rondo neighborhood, what it particularly took out was the black-owned business district. And so it wasn't just a matter of taking out a lot of houses or just a matter of dividing the neighborhood in half, but it was also, on top of that, a matter of taking out this essential heart of the community.
Imagine being about 6, 7, and somebody trying to describe to you why your house is being torn down so that a road that takes up a whole block wide could be built. I mean, I recall not even believing it.
That route for I-94 was selected in part because they were going to wipe out St. Paul's ghetto. Didn't wipe out a ghetto, never was a ghetto.
It was a very traumatic event in my life. I had a number of friends around our house, and you're just kind of bonding with them, and we were uprooted by the freeway coming through.
During the 1960s, urban economic development had everything to do with demolition and clearance.
Although it was a mixed-race neighborhood, Rondo was really the center of the African American community, and it was a place where people knew each other.
You know, it was a friendly neighborhood. It was a village.
Not only did we know when each other was getting a new bicycle, you know, but everybody knew when somebody was getting a new pair of shoes.
It was really close-knit. Everybody did know, almost everybody. So it was a very safe, very self-contained neighborhood. Whatever you wanted, it was there.
It's a pretty clear case where the civic leaders did not act responsibly, and their prejudice created issues that we're still dealing with in St. Paul and in Minneapolis too.
We had kind of a bubble that was burst in the name of progress and probably in the name of integration as well, by some definition. And when that bubble was burst, instead of that community being so much greater and embellished because of progress, you know, we lost a lot.
And now I'll share your presentation, Mr. Anderson.
You could go to the first slide. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marvin Roger Anderson, and I am here and honored to be here and a part of the panel that is searching for environmental justice in conjunction with the construction of interstate freeways. That short presentation there was just an example of some of the voices that you might hear in Rondo, in the community of Rondo. And what we're trying to do in this short presentation here is lay the foundation for what was about almost a 50-year period of anguish, of resentment, of a diaspora of our community, and the creation of a pathway to a new Rondo, which we hope will eventually emerge from the work that we are undertaking right now. Next slide, please. The last voice you heard there was Melvin Carter, who happens to be the father of the current mayor of St. Paul. And he said, instead of encouraging integration, we lost everything. And not only did we lose everything, they bulldozed Rondo, which was the economic and the social center of our community. It's almost 20 blocks that we lost of a complete devastation. The vibrancy of our city blocks, our homes and businesses, our civic organizations and social clubs, all of our institutions, playgrounds, and churches. Dr. Mindy Fullerlove, who is an urban psychiatrist, caused this shock. And what she's trying to convey is that the damage is more than physical. There's been so much freeway construction and urban renewal construction throughout the United States, and they tend to focus on the physical devastation of these communities. But Dr. Fullerlove says that root shock. It's more than physical. It is a damage to an individual's personal ecosystem. This is the internal map that they use in order to go from place to place within their community. When they wake up in the morning, they have a pattern. They know where to go. And when all of that is taken away from an individual, when all of the touch points where they would go each day to say hello to a neighbor, to say hello to a friend, to get their milk, to get a haircut, to get to do whatever they do on a normal basis, when that has been physically torn away and there's not a viable alternative, that's root shock that Dr. Fullerlove compares to an amputation or a severe burn. And about 1,600 African-American enclaves, districts, neighborhoods, and communities around the United States between 1956 and 1968-70 suffered from some form of root shock. And 1 million people were involved in this. About 1 million people. And that type of damage is what we call intergenerational trauma. It's an assault. And that trauma is passed down and down and down, and it affects the ability of those communities to reconstruct themselves in places that are far away from their original place where they had been able to establish a community of, where they were able to establish a village. Next slide, please. We had this in Rondo, and it was going on for quite some time. And then a few of us got together in 1982, and we said that this resentment that our elders were carrying back in 1983, I didn't consider myself an elder, I do now, but we were trying to give them a sense that there was a pathway forward, that we didn't have to remain angry with MnDOT about what happened in Rondo. And so in 1982, we planned the first celebration of Rondo Days, which was a neighborhood celebration, a 3-day celebration, where we would come together with our friends and our families, invite people to come home. We fed every senior in Rondo, and we would have a free dinner. We would have an ecumenical church service. We'd have a grand parade. And that's been going on now until COVID for 36 years in Rondo. And then in 2015, we decided that we had done enough to raise the consciousness of Rondo, and let's have a reconciliation and healing ceremony where we invited 4 100-year-old plus residents of Rondo. We asked those in attendance to write on a sheet of paper every resentment, every anger, every pain that the construction of I-94 gave them. And we asked our seniors to light a match and burn those in an urn. And then we buried them at the Rondo Commemorative Plaza under a mound. But more importantly, Charlie Zelli, the Commissioner of Transportation at the time, and Chris Coleman, the mayor of the city of St. Paul, did something that no other public officials, to our belief, has done in any place in the country. They made formal apologies. They would never build an interstate through the heart of the Rondo community. We could never build that kind of atrocity today. And today we acknowledge the sins of our past. We regret the stain of racism that allowed so callous a decision as the one that led families to be dragged from their homes, creating a diaspora of the African-American community in Rondo. That was the foundation of what we consider to be the new Rondo, but we still had a few problems that we needed to contend with and bring out so that the new Rondo would be able to look at all of the problems confronting our community before we went forward. Next slide, please. And these are how
Ms. Anderson.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, how many more slides do you have in the essence of time?
Just do this one.
Okay.
Minnesota's the best and the worst. Affordability, economy, quality of life. It's the 4th worst place for African Americans. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We'll go beyond this. We'll go beyond this. This is what our idea is. We want to do one back, please. We want to do a land bridge about 3,200 linear feet long. That is an image of what the land bridge would look like. Next slide. New housing, new jobs, growing a community, retail and office space, increasing the city revenues. Next one. This is our financing model. It's not just going to be public and public money. We hope to tap private people, philanthropic money that will all contribute to this grand idea. And last slide. Next slide. Thank you.
We will probably cover some of your other slide as we go through our presentation.
Next, we go to Cyrus Knutson for a brief comment.
Yes, thank you, Greg. And again, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be on this panel with such esteemed members. I know Mr. Anderson is the citizens of the state of Minnesota, truly, and I've had the pleasure of knowing him now for 4 years. And every time we meet, every time I hear him speak, I learn something new. And I've recently, even though I've worked at the MnDOT for many years, Dr. Lloyd and I had never met before. And I'm really honored to have recently met Dr. Lloyd and had some conversations with him, and Dr. Muthyala, as I've just met. I'm very honored to be again on the panel with such esteemed folks. So what I wanted to do was really just put this in context a little bit about what's the context of the Rondo Land Bridge with respect to MnDOT. And following what Mr. Anderson briefly described as the Rondo Land Bridge, if I might add that it really is also presented by Reconnect Rondo as an act of restorative justice to essentially replace what was lost, but not to just replace it, but also to present something that can grow and provide long into the future for not only for the citizens of Rondo and others today, but well into the future, and really be a model for what can happen in places where communities were disrupted by highways. So I just want to touch on briefly before moving on, talk a little bit about MnDOT's response to this and the role. And as Mr. Anderson said, former Commissioner Zelli apologized, and it was at that apology that really sparked some other ideas about how we would look at transportation planning differently, look at transportation projects differently. The initiative that is called Rethinking I-94 was launched at about that time. The idea for the Office of Senate, which has become the Center for Community Connections, was begun at that time, as well as some other initiatives that we'll touch on later in the discussion today. And what we've been doing now for nearly 4 years is working with Reconnect Rondo to understand this concept and what it presents, and how to help and facilitate how they might develop this project and actually see it built. While MnDOT does have a regulatory role, a role that requires receiving permission from the department and the federal government, for that matter, for building such a thing in the interstate highway, we also are, through our work with them, are also learning what it takes and how to do this. These are really large, complicated projects. Of the land bridges of this magnitude, there are a number of them around the country. There's some under construction now. We have 9 caps in Minnesota. These are largely park settings. And we know how to build a basic land bridge, or a cap, as they're otherwise called. But what Reconnect Rondo is presenting is something really, truly extraordinary. And it's also an honor and a pleasure to actually be working on this project and working with Reconnect Rondo as a community organization that is leading this effort. And so we'd like to get on to other issues. I want to just say before we move on to that what Rondo presents for us is a different method of planning, and we're seeing this all over the country. That communities are actually engaging in planning themselves, not government, but actual communities. We see this in variety of places around the country. In Minnesota, Reconnect Rondo is not the only one. And this is really an important part of what we're seeing, and it's also maybe an answer to some of the subject matter to come in the discussion. So with that, I will close those comments and look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Cyrus. And now we'll go to Dr. Brian Muthyala for a comment.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for asking me to be on this great panel. I, feel very privileged to be here today for many reasons. So as I was introduced, I attended school in the Rondo neighborhood. I celebrated Rondo days when I was growing up. I didn't know that Mr. Anderson had kind of created it or started it many years ago. And I grew up in St. Paul and really spent a lot of time there, and still do. And now in my role as I'm a practicing internist and pediatrician. I care for patients who come from all over the state, but predominantly from the Twin Cities. And so I see the everyday health effects that our environments kind of lead to people. And then I'm also a course director in the medical school, in which I teach first year brand new medical students how to take how to do a physical exam, so how to use a stethoscope, and how to interview or how to talk to patients. And I think on first, and in that class, I teach on the social determinants of health, and I teach specifically on the Highway 94 and the Highway 35W builds and how those impacted communities. And I think on first blush, you may ask yourselves, well, how are those two related, right? How does learning how to use a stethoscope relate in any way, shape, or form to understanding the history of our communities? And I get asked this question every year by students, and I tell them that this is just as important. This is just as important as knowing which way to put it in and to know where to listen, know what questions to ask. We also have to understand where our patients come from, and understanding their histories, because their histories are ours. And only through understanding the histories of where our communities come from, how they look, why they look the way they do. I think we live in a pretty ahistorical society, so we don't understand why things look the way they do, and we think that they just happen this way. Oh, it just happened that this community has worse health outcomes than others. Oh, it just happens that this population ends up in the hospital a little bit more than others, and it's just not true. And so through this example and many other examples, we start to show that it's just as fundamental to understanding how to care for people as using a stethoscope as it is to understand their histories. And only through that combined shared understanding and bringing that understanding to bear by learning, and on top of learning all of the biochemistry and cell biology and clinical skills and all of those things, can students become successful clinicians and really care for people in the way that we want them to and hope that they do when they graduate. And so I think we'll talk, I'm sure, more about this, but this gets to this topic really gets to the heart of health, the direct impacts of what a highway can do to a community in terms of air pollution, access to resources, the changing of a community. But it also gets to the downstream effects that are much more hidden in terms of the downstream consequences that are financial, political, social. These are traumas like other traumas, and they have real life consequences to the health of our patients and then the health of our communities. And so I look forward to a robust conversation this evening.
Thank you. Let me just go to our former question now. My first question I'd like to go to Mr. Anderson. You may have touched on some of this in your slide presentation, but how has the work of the Rondo community in documenting and commemorating its history prepare you and the community for making this land bridge proposal? And also, how has the work you've been doing for over 35 years in Rondo laid the groundwork for the proposal?
Thank you so much, Dr. Lloyd, for that question. The history, like I was trying to emphasize, is that there was a shock to our community, and the community really hadn't regained the confidence that it had in Rondo, which was a village, and it was self-supporting village, and people knew each other and depended on each other and had ways to go. So the Rondo Day Celebration, each year we had a theme, and the theme would be the clubs of Rondo, social clubs of Rondo, the athletics of Rondo, the fine arts of Rondo, the dances of Rondo, the poems of Rondo. Each year we tried to highlight an aspect that was prevalent in the Rondo community so that the young people could come to see that Rondo was a fully functioning, fleshed out, day-to-day place that had core values, that had goals and objectives, that had a treasured way of dealing with segregated life and discriminatory life, that if you understood these core values, you could go anywhere in the world and trust that you had the grounding and the education and the fearlessness that others gave you. So we prepared our young to do this. The elders felt this. So our goal was just to inculcate and celebrate those parts of the Rondo community that we felt would be able to, young people could understand and with their imaginations and use this history as a way to protect themselves in the future.
Cyrus or Doctor, you want to chime in? Anything you'd like to add to that? If not, go ahead. Okay. My next question will go to Cyrus. I worked for MnDOT for almost 40 years myself, so I understand the political structure of the organization for sure. How does MnDOT the descendant of the agency that built this freeway build trust with communities that it might now seek to work with? And also, what evidence can you point to that MnDOT as a trusted agent of transportation fund will follow through with a commitment to address communities that the agencies acknowledge were harmed by past transportation decision and policies?
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. Before I begin, I just, Greg, please alert me if there's a problem with my transmission. I noticed I may be having a problem with my my service here. But I did get the whole question. So, you know, as stated earlier, the former Commissioner Zelli apologized to the people of Rondo for what had happened. It didn't stop there. The leadership of Governor Walz's administration, Transportation Commissioner Margaret Anderson Kelleher, provide leadership in these matters that really encourage and direct us to continue this work. Governor Walz has specifically asked state employees to get out and meet the people that we serve and listen to them. Margaret Anderson Kelleher, the commissioner, has made equity one of the principal goals and objectives of the department and all the work that we do. And what that really requires us to do is to really listen. And a great many efforts have been made in the last many years to get out and engage in different ways, to really listen to community, to go visit people where they are, to go to community events and participate and present at those community events, excuse me. But I think there's a really important element in this. It's like that showing up's not enough. We really do have to listen. And I want to quote Mr. Melvin Giles, who is a resident of Rondo and active in the community. He was on a panel discussion having equity invitation. And Mr. Giles spoke of collaboration from the heart. And although we are public servants and can acknowledge what Dr. Lloyd said about the nature of institutions, we are public servants and we can lead from the heart. We still have duties, we have responsibilities, we have core missions, but really we serve the people, and that really is becoming more and more important, and it's being expressed by our leadership as something that's very important today. I think that there's a number of efforts that have been happening around the Twin Cities particularly, as well as around Minnesota, and in which of a how they actually use the transportation, how does it actually affect them? And the development of a livability framework, which comes out of rethinking I-94 conversation. This effort is led by my esteemed colleague Gloria Jeff, who actually is attending attendance tonight. And that development of that livability framework gets at the things that the community told us in the phase 1 of rethinking I-94, that what's important to people is health and environment, economics, jobs, the sense of place, safety, meaning personal safety in this case, not just automobile and motor vehicle safety, and also the connections, which is what I am really focused on primarily, is how do we reconnect that which was divided by these major highways. Equity is also an important objective and a goal for the department, as I mentioned earlier. And then again, coming back to trust and really thinking about that trust and how do we earn that trust. The department in many ways and many times has acknowledged that what was done to these communities, the harm that was caused, has damaged trust. And it's really an important effort underway now to really try to rebuild that trust through many of these efforts. Thank you.
Oop, Dr. Lloyd, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
I was saying that one thing I can say about MnDOT, by working there for 40 years, the one thing that we always try to build into people, to employees, the ability to trust that you're providing a great service to the community. Because if you're not providing a great service to the community, no matter what it is, you're not doing your job. So I just want to put that in there. My next question, I go to Dr. Muthyala. How does the Rondo Land Bridge proposal address the concern you raised about the public health ramification of freeways and the intergenerational trauma caused by freeway construction? You touched upon a little bit of that a while ago, but can you add some more to that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this gets to a really important heart of it. I think when we think of, when I went to medical school, or historically when we think of environmental justice, again, we think of air pollution, sound pollution, water pollution, and those are all real legitimate concerns that impact all of our communities, particularly communities that have been marginalized and under-resourced. But I think what we don't talk about is how trauma and traumatic events really impacts people and communities. And there is growing very sound research that really gets to the heart of that. These early, so I'm a internist, but I'm also a pediatrician, and particularly in the pediatric literature, there's strong evidence that early exposure to childhood traumas impact your health outcomes down the road. So if you were exposed to a traumatic event, that could be violence, that could be disorder, that could be economic hardship, it could be a myriad of things. Your risk of things like high blood pressure, diabetes, strokes are much higher when you're an adult, everything else being equal. And I think there's now growing and that those traumas actually affect us on the cellular level, the genetic level of our body. So that you know, if you are thinking and talking about trauma, you're thinking about not just an emotional or a cognitive response to something, but something that's really imbued within our DNA, literally. And I say this to the students a lot: when you're talking about racism, oftentimes you're talking about trauma, and you're talking about real painful trauma that is kind of perpetuated on our communities. And so I think we do have to think about how these traumas, again, have these downstream effects that we see that impact generations of communities and people, and that this land bridge is a step. Mr. Anderson spoke about a beautiful, what I can only imagine was a beautiful reconciliation ceremony, that hopes that was a first step in righting a wrong. And I think that is the first step of many steps that need to be taken to right this particular wrong that caused so much trauma in a particular community, that we're still seeing the health impacts today. And so this land bridge isn't going to fix what happened. This land bridge isn't going to fix air pollution or water pollution or sound pollution, but this land bridge is a first step of directly reinvesting in the heart of a community that had its heart ripped out, right? And so it's the first step of reinvesting and reinvigorating and really saying, you are important to us, and that we need to do better by you through this type of investment. And I think that it will be really interesting to see this land bridge. I mean, I see it as, again, as a place of potential healing, and that's the only way you get through trauma, is through that physical process of healing that needs to happen, and that's the way you impact intergenerational trauma, and that's the only way you impact, I think, change kind of the curve in which people's lives and communities' lives take shape.
Mm. Thank you for that. And moving further from that, Mr. Anderson, you had a slide which said 300 businesses were taken, 700 homes were taken. If that's not ripping the heart out of the community, I don't know what is, because that was just devastation. Mr. Anderson, President Biden, Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, is on the record saying that, quote, it disproportionately Black and brown neighborhoods that were divided by highway projects, plowing through them because they didn't have the political capital to resist. We have a chance to get that right, close quote. But this isn't the first time, is it? We heard this type of statement. President Obama, Transportation Secretary Anthony Fox, also said that, quote, we now know overwhelmingly that our urban freeway will almost always routed through low income and minority neighborhood, creating disconnection from opportunities that exist to this day, unquote. Are you hopeful that these words will result in tangible outcomes that benefit Black communities, that federal transportation planners are prepared to marshal significant resources to this issue?
Thank you. We like to believe at Reconnect Rondo that there is a time and a purpose for everything, and that the time is right for this to happen, that allows us to say with confidence that we have a moral case, we have a restorative case, we have an economic case, we have a health outcome case, and we have a just case for all of the things that we hope for in the land bridge to get a favorable response from local, state, and the federal government. I think some of the projects in the past, and I'm not trying to compare our projects to those in the past, but they may have lacked one of those fundamental foundations that allow other people to understand and support what we're trying to do. We know that in Minnesota, the educational outcomes are worse for the African Americans. We know the health outcomes for African Americans are worse. We know that in African American communities in St. Paul, the housing is the worst. The home ownership is the worst. That we are at the bottom. If you take the 18 factors that describe a healthy community, and these are food, access to health, access to recreation. If you take these 18 factors, and you compare them to the Rondo community, I think we are barely passing in 3 of those 18 factors that a healthy community can have. So what we're trying to let people understand and know is that we've done the research, we've prepared ourselves, and we're ready to make a statement that morally, economically, environmentally, and restoratively, and because it's just right, this land bridge project touches and can make an effect on those 18 factors of a healthy community. It can provide affordable housing and jobs. So we're going to make this case very strongly. And we're making it not just for Rondo. The reason that we're so adamant about this is that when other communities prepare and do the diligence and the hard work that we've done, they can convince their skeptics that that's a good project for them, because I know that the outcomes that we have for Rondo, that we're hoping for Rondo, will be shared by the whole state of Minnesota. And these other communities that have had the similar history like Rondo, they can argue very persuasively that they can do it in Minnesota, we can do it here, and we become a model. Not just Rondo, not just Reconnect Rondo, but our Department of Transportation, our health, the Department of Health. This is a total project that brings together all members of a community for a common outcome that results in a better life for people. Minnesota's done it in the past. We want to make sure Minnesota does it again for overcoming a trauma that about 1,200 communities have suffered as a result of freeway construction.
How do you, I can feel and see your passion, and I can feel and see your passion, Mr. Anderson, and what you are doing. How do you keep it up? How do you continue to keep the community energized to the dream? It reminds me of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. drum major speech. You're out in front, you're out in front of the parade. You're going to be the drum major. You're going to be the trendsetter, so to speak. So how do you keep it going?
I owe it. I'm paying a debt. I'm repaying a debt that those elders, like my mother and my father, that toiled. My father worked on the railroad. My grandfather was a Pullman porter. My father was a waiter on the railroad. My father spent almost 35 years working on the railroad as a waiter, working 14, 15 hours a day, spending his nights in what they called the dormitory car that didn't have heat. The heat from the locomotive kept them warm. My grandfather would spend 23 hours on call as a Pullman porter. He didn't even have a bed. He slept in the men's bathroom. He did that for 40 years. And there are so many other people in Rondo that had to endure such harsh conditions in order for people like me and so many others to get an education, to change to change the trajectory of our community so that we would not have to endure what they endured. And the conditions of the African American in America in the 20th century, I've seen, and had the United Nations been in existence then, it could have been prosecuted as a crime against humanity. They were the most appalling conditions that people had to suffer. I owe it to them because they got up every morning, they went to work, they came home, and they came back to the Rondo community where they felt safe, and they gave us core values, they gave us a spirituality, they gave us a history, they gave us laughter, they gave us great food, they taught us how to dance, and they taught us how to survive in a hostile world. So I owe that to the elders who raised me, and I owe all of that they gave me to transfer to the imaginations of our young, so they don't have to endure another form of this, because it hasn't stopped. So that's what keeps me going, Dr. Lloyd, because the race isn't over. The fight continues, and we all must commit ourselves to the idea that until America comes to grips with this sin of racism, we can't really sleep. There's no real rest. Our rest will come when free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. We haven't reached there yet, but I'm still doing my best to stay in there.
Thank you for that. The next question would belong to Cyrus. In addition to the land bridge, what other strategies MnDOT is exploring to mitigate the environmental and health impacts of freeways?
I first want to acknowledge what Mr. Anderson just said in the passion in which he delivered it. And I think that is such a critically important message and so heartfelt that it makes other things seem rather unimportant. Nonetheless, we'll touch on this briefly. MnDOT first began thinking about sustainability a number of years ago, and then started to explore what that really meant for MnDOT, and it led to the formation of an office that's led by an assistant commissioner who reports to the deputy commissioner. Commissioner Kelleher added public health to that office's purpose, and that office is currently developing strategic goals, thinking about what kind of actions the department might take and how that might happen. And I think that's really an important step forward. One of the things that one of the strategic goals that's expressed, and this is available on MnDOT's website should anybody want to take a look at it, is to ensure that engagement includes underrepresented communities. And especially in light of what Mr. Anderson just said, I think that is a theme that's become very important at MnDOT, and that we really pay attention to those that have been underserved, those that have suffered disproportionate harm. And we really need to put our efforts into seeing that some of these things change, and we do what we can to do about these issues of harm, of racism, and all of the ill effects of it, because it harms our entire society. I can't really emphasize that enough, but some of the other things that we've done to try to implement, really thinking about how do we actually think about health. In 2016, a health impact assessment was actually performed on the state's multimodal transportation plan to look at what might be the health effects of that plan. People are continuing to explore developing partnerships with health departments, with other programs, with communities, to really learn and understand beyond the standard noise and air issues that regulations that we follow and have for decades. It's really now expanding into other areas, as I said earlier, talking about the Livability Framework, that idea of personal safety as a form of health. And really listening to what people's experiences are and how highways affect them has become an important part of what MnDOT's trying to explore. I think that's really the critical issues. And I think it's really just in recent years, this has become a topic that a great many people are actually working on in the department. It's emphasized by our leadership. And I think I really am optimistic that we're going to see some real good proposals on how we can actually enact better health outcomes in the highway corridors. It is a work in progress.
Will this be a part of the Rethinking 94 process?
It is currently. The Livability Framework that's being developed is actually is intended to be applied to Rethink, as well as all of our major projects in the future, to bring in those social and economic, environmental aspects in new and different ways than we've really ever considered them before.
Okay. It'll be standard policy moving forward.
That is the intent, that we are developing new practices, and ultimately that will lead to perhaps even policies to support those practices.
Thank you. Dr. Muthyala, in your capacity as both a doctor and teacher of future doctors, has this discussion within medical education and practice changed in regard to racial and environmental justice? And also, will our future doctors be more knowledgeable about these issues?
Boy, I hope so. I mean, this was not part of the idea of health equity as like a major cornerstone of curriculum, was not part of my medical school training. And to be honest, I think when I hear Mr. Knutson talk about the DOT rethinking its way of doing business, I could substitute DOT and I could put medical school in there. I think that all these kind of institutions, right? Medical school is an institution, Department of Transportation is an institution, are being pushed and forced now to rethink how we do business, because we haven't been doing business well enough. A lot of the same questions and concerns that were raised when I was a student are some of the same questions and concerns that are being raised now by students. We have for example, we have a deep and worsening pipeline issue in medicine. The actual percentage of Black physicians has decreased in 50 years. That's unconscionable. That's tragic, and that is harmful to the health overall of Black communities, and it's harmful to the health overall of all of our communities. So there is major and deep work that needs to be done to fix the house of medicine, so to speak. I think that the University of Minnesota has been pushed frankly, by external forces, by students, by activists, by community members, to say that things need to be different. I am in awe of our students who, after the killing of George Floyd, basically said to our medical school, the way that you have been training us is not preparing us for our current reality. It is not preparing us to be future doctors, and we need to do, and you must do better for us and for future students. And changes takes time, and I think I've seen globally there's a lot of talk now. There's more talk, I think, which the panelists and I think perhaps likely members of the audience also are worried about talk, right? Talk only gets us so far, and I think we have to see actual change. And I think that there is a recognition, a slow recognition, but a recognition that again, this is as essential to learning how to be a doctor as learning how to use a stethoscope and talk to patients. Understanding this is crucial to being a physician. I also think that it's been interesting for me to hear Mr. Knutson talk about the importance of engaging with community in decision making and in process. And it seems so basic, and it has never been the case that institutions have involved community in anything. And I think that's also starting to change, because I think that there is a growing, I think it's slow, but I think there's a growing recognition that if I am being trained to serve a community, I need to have that community part of the process from the beginning. We need to involve them and engage them to help guide what are our outcomes, what are our objectives, what are our goals. If I make them all, that's a problem. If the medical school makes them all, that's a problem. But if we co-collaborate with students, community physicians, academic physicians, community members to say, here are our goals that we've made together of what students need to be able to do when they're done, then we've gotten to a better place. And I think that, and I call myself a pragmatic optimist. I believe and hope that change is possible, and I'm not necessarily disappointed when it doesn't happen. But it allows me to continue to do the work that I think is needed to move the ball ever slowly forward.
Thank you so much for your passion as well, because I know this passion from all three panelists tonight, a passion that I fundamentally believe will make a tremendous difference in the lives of people that we serve, that you serve. And now I would like to open it up to the rest of the group for questioning.
I wanted to ask a question that is posed in the chat from one of our audience members, and I'll direct this to Cyrus initially. Something that's caught the eye of the members of Public History of 35W is to see how the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the city councils, both cities, have gone on record opposing any future expansions within their city limits of the freeways. Cyrus, I wonder if you can say if and how DOT has received those calls and how they're thinking about them.
Yeah, I can touch on that briefly. So obviously we are aware that the both city councils have done this. We work with our government partners regularly, particularly with the Think project and in other areas of both cities. And with respect to the project, the rethinking of it is now under an open National Environmental Policy Act process, and as such, it is institutional. It is a federal policy. It is a process we must follow, and it includes talking about alternatives at a specific place and time in that process. And we are not at that point yet. Therefore, nothing is off and nothing is on the table, so to speak, until those things happen. And I think the thing I think that we want to emphasize too is that can acknowledge that folks are having difficult with that process, and it's not just here, it's everywhere, it's around the country. That policy is very old, practices developed around it, and I have seen criticisms in other parts of the country about how that functions. Its essence and its purpose is to see that we take into account on these projects the social, environmental aspects of that and their effects on the community and on these matters, and ensure that people's voices are heard. And that will continue to happen. But until those processes run their course, we really can't talk about alternatives and make any declarations about what will or won't happen. So I hope that's a satisfactory answer for this evening.
Thank you, Cyrus. I wanted to pose another question from the audience, and this time to Mr. Marvin Anderson, a member of the South Minneapolis community and a member of our Public History of 35W project team asks, when will the land bridge open? What are the major hurdles to getting it done? Can you update us on the status of
it? Wow. Well, if the person who asked that question is available, we could use all of the volunteers that we could have and even get the answer. We're in the it's a long-term process. We've been working on it now for 4 years, and we never thought it was going to be easy. It never did. Right now, we have a bill before the Minnesota legislature to get some pre-planning dollars. We were fortunate to submit an application and a grant on the behest of our congressperson in the 4th Congressional District to raise some funds from the federal government. We worked with a number of foundations in order to get funding for what we're trying to do. Our immediate task is to raise about $6 million to have pre-planning dollars, which will be used for the studies and the consultants that we would need in order to lay out a land bridge, how long it would be, how much it would cost, where it would actually be. There's 2 A and a B plan, whether or not it goes from one place to the other. All of that needs to be decided, and there are legal problems that we need to work out with MnDOT. So we're looking basically not before 2025, 26, to be able to see where we are, what our possibilities are. If all goes according to plan, it could be an 8 to 10-year effort, and that's okay. There's a joy in being able to plant an acorn, and that somebody down the road will be able to enjoy the shade. Those of us who've been out here for a long time would be satisfied that it happened, because it's happening not just for Rondo. I got to keep emphasizing that. It's happening because we're at a point in our history where there's great contention, people pulling on both sides, not just on the highways, but on the environment, on taxes, on culture. And out of this tension, there's bound to be a solution that benefits the majority of Americans. And we're in that mix. And if we know that the final decision about when the land bridge will be built will be based upon the best information, an unbiased critical analysis of the facts, taking into consideration all that's been heard, and the decision is made, I think we can live with that. What we can't live with, and what we'll fight against and to my dying breath, is a decision that's based upon the fact that, well, Rondo was a slum, it should have been destroyed, and there was nothing there in the beginning. I'm against decisions that will be made in an asinine way that will play to somebody's conception of we're not entitled, or that community's not entitled, or there's a better way. A fair, logical analysis of our plan, of our studies, and our proposal, we believe that the decision will be made to grant that the land bridge will be made, it will be built. So that's what we're hoping for. And that might take 2 or 3 years to get that decision. And if that decision is made, it might take 2 or 3 years to build it. So anyway we're looking at it, we're looking at a 6 to 8, maybe a 10-year process. But if it's all going according to what I just said, we can live with it, and we can stay there, because the end game, the result will be what we've all worked for, and the end result will be something that will benefit this community in the state of Minnesota.
Thanks so much, Mr. Anderson. I love that metaphor of planting an acorn and enjoying the shade years down the road. I want to ask, in all seriousness, a quick follow-up question, though. You said if volunteers are available, could the Reconnect Rondo project make use of volunteers?
Oh, I think absolutely. Our website, I sound like a commercial, www.reconnectrondo.com. We're having some listening sessions. We're having some community workshops starting in about 2 weeks. And the purpose of these community workshops and listening sessions is to bring people in that want to learn more about how a land bridge is built, how you arrive at decisions, how community wealth can be built. Hopefully that through this effort here, we can put our website up, and then by checking into our website, you can read about our studies. Our studies are up there, how we've arrived at these conclusions, where we want to go with the Rondo Land Bridge, how people can get involved, bring your expertise to sit in on we have community workshops on affordable housing, the rest of gentrification. We have community workshops that people can, and these are repeated. So I would urge people, if they want to get involved, if they just want to hear more about we are one of the most well-organized, I have to say this, one of the most well-organized efforts that I've ever been involved with. And I've been involved with a lot of different efforts over the years. Reconnect Rondo is setting a standard as to how it can be done. And the proof of that is when your audience comes to our website and clicks in, they can find a place where they can lean in, and we would welcome their participation and their expertise.
Fabulous. Thank you. A question for Dr. Muthyala, again, from the audience. Can you point to any specific recent research that seems exciting or insightful about highways, public health, pollution, freeways?
That's a great question. I think that in general, I think there's a lot known about the impact that highways have, again, in terms of those direct health costs. So again, air, water, sound, I think those are pretty well known. But I think today the data, the technology exists to really drill down to those neighborhoods, sometimes even by the street level of which of those communities are most impacted. So I think we're able to better identify who's most harmed in really specific ways, which I think is really exciting in terms of creating and crafting stories and narratives around who is most and disproportionately impacted by environmental injustice. I think also, as I mentioned, that this whole other larger conversation that's happening right now around, again, the idea of trauma and its real health impacts, I think is something that is just in its infancy. Some of the more kind of fundamental and foundational studies on trauma and its health impacts are maybe 5-6 years old. And so this is a really new field, and we're identifying it's not all that controversial to say that structural racism is a driver for health. That's a relatively new thing for a doctor to say. I think it's not a new thing for people to say, but and I think that as we start to refine that and say, what does that mean and how does it play themselves out, I think we're going to start to really understand, I think, what people and communities have known all along, and it is, I think, disappointing that maybe we had to find how it affects our quote unquote our biology, something that's socio and political has to affect our biology before doctors will maybe pay that close attention to it. But I think that there's starting to be more conversations about the importance of this. And there's starting to be larger conversations in the medical communities that we as physicians have to be prepared to talk to our patients about this, talk to our communities about this, and not just do that, but how do we then create interventions and solutions and be part of those solutions moving forward.
I have a follow-up question for you, Doctor.
Go ahead, Ernest.
Okay. I heard or read anecdotally that there have been evidence of better air quality due to, the COVID-19 and the stay-at-home orders around the state and the country. They have reduced and also reduced driving. As a physician, what evidence have you noticed? Of course, it's been a short window. What evidence have you noticed regarding the reduction in kids with asthma over the past 15 months versus kids living adjacent to freeways or by zip code, and where they were in where there were any significant changes that you noticed?
I can't speak to it relating directly to highways, but I can say that masking and social distancing has dramatically decreased the rates of pediatric respiratory illnesses across the country, from flu to RSV. Our hospitals in the winter are usually full of people who have respiratory illnesses, and the numbers were very, very low. And so whether that's masking and social distancing on top of decreased kind of air pollution levels in general, because of less driving and things, I think it's hard to know, but absolutely we've seen a drastic change in terms of what we're seeing in terms of children and adults, frankly, admitted to the hospital with breathing problems overall during the COVID pandemic.
Oh, that's really interesting. I really want to know for the end of the data for sure. Well, thank you for that. We're going to wrap up now, and we want to thank all the panelists for your insightful question and answer period, and also people who have been listening in. Hope you learned from what we had prepared for you tonight. I know I have. And we just only wish and hope that the land bridge is built, reduction in asthma and other trauma that faced by children and people and adults, and also that transportation policy will continue to be beneficial toward people of color, BIPOC, and everybody in general, because we all have to abide by the Environmental Justice Act of 2020. They talk about environmental justice for all, not just some folks, but for all. With that, I would thank you and good night and happy Cinco de Mayo.
Mr. Anderson, I see you've got a hand raised. Do you want to have a final word?
I just wanted to let Dr. Lloyd and the other people who are involved in the I-35 study know that if you think Reconnect Rondo can be of any help or assistance in you, please call on us, because we understand your pain. We understand what's happened here. It didn't happen the same way, but please be aware that if Reconnect Rondo can reach out in brotherhood and sisterhood and share any of our resources with you, our studies, and if that would help you, please let us know.
Thank you so much for
the
saying
invitation. That. All right.
Thank you.
And lastly, I'll just thank our hosts, the Bell Museum,
yes,
Hennepin History Museum, for helping us put on this event tonight. And thank you all again for coming. And thanks to our panelists. And Mr. Anderson, really very sincerely, thank you for all the work that you've been doing over the course of your entire life in Rondo. Thank you.
Amen.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.